Order in the room, let that phrase mean courage rather than quiet, structure rather than suppression, a shared agreement that arguments deserve a frame strong enough to survive their sharpest edges. Consider how a chamber settles when stakes are named honestly, not to hush dissent, but to hold it in a shape where listening can do its work. This address sets two crafts beside one another without caricature, the discipline of judging and the urgency of legislating. One is the craft of measuring twice and cutting once, wary of shortcuts that feel humane in the moment and lawless in the long run. The other is the craft of moving a community from diagnosis to remedy, impatient with ceremonies that mistake procedure for progress. Bring those crafts into the same room and the air changes. A different kind of seriousness takes root, one that refuses both fatalism and frenzy. Within that frame, two public servants illustrate the contrast with unusual clarity. Edith Holland Jones, a veteran of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and for a season its chief judge, embodies the judicial temperament at its most architectural. Text as blueprint, precedent as rebar, jurisdiction and standards of review as the hidden beams that keep the whole structure from collapsing under political weather. Jasmine Crockett, an attorney who now serves as the United States representative for Texas's 30th Congressional District and previously defended clients as a public defender and advocated in the Texas House, embodies the legislative temperament at its most kinetic. Committee questions as tools that reveal fissures in familiar walls. Floor debates as scaffolding that rises or lowers, depending on what ordinary people actually need to reach. Name them not as combatants in a spectacle, but as stewards of complementary virtues, restraint that protects liberty from the zeal of any hour, an initiative that protects liberty from the complacency of any decade. Order in the room under this understanding does not demand that one vocation bow to the other. It demands that each do its duty with clarity and that both accept the discipline of reasons. Public can inspect. Judging in this telling is the hard labor of translation, taking the will of elected branches as written, testing it against constitutional limits, and applying it to facts without smuggling personal preference through the back door. Legislating in this telling is the hard labor of invention, assembling coalitions, revising drafts, trading imperfections for momentum, and sending into the world a new set of sentences that can bear the weight of everyday life. These are not rival religions. They are interlocking chores of self-government. Where judging resists improvisation for the sake of predictability, legislating embraces experimentation for the sake of repair. A mature republic wants both instincts alive at once, because each corrects the other's worst temptation, the judge's temptation to worship form even when form has become a cage, and the representative's temptation to worship urgency, even when urgency has not been disciplined by feasibility. Imagine the courtroom or hearing room that models this balance. Arguments arrive with edges, but edges are welcomed rather than dulled. Questions probe not to score, but to understand where a premise begins and where it breaks. Claims are tested against text and against consequence. Silence is allowed to linger long enough for nuance to find a voice. Listeners grant one another the gift of good faith, and advocates repay that gift by refusing to hide weaknesses in fog. In such a room, a judge like Jones becomes a guardian against erosion, reminding citizens that law's power lies in its resistance to heat, that rights survive precisely because they are not recalculated every hour to satisfy appetite. In the same room, a representative like Crockett becomes a conductor of civic energy, reminding citizens that law's legitimacy lies in its traction with lived experience, that promises become brittle if they never bend toward people they were written to protect. Set beside one another, these portraits generate productive tension. The judicial craft asks again and again by what authority, through what channel, according to what standard, with what remedy fitted to the wrong, and no farther. The legislative craft asks again and again, for whose benefit, at whose cost, within which horizon, with what metric that counts human realities and not only comfortable abstractions. When the two crafts ignore each other, the country feels it. A politics that forgets judicial discipline starts to treat power as a blank check for noble causes, and noble causes are the easiest places to hide overreach. A jurisprudence that forgets legislative urgency starts to treat stability as an idol, and idols justify neglect by calling it patience. Bring them back into conversation, and democracy recovers its balance. Deliberation slows the stampede without turning it into a sit-in. Direction propels the march without turning it into a stampede. Order in the room becomes not a muzzle but a method, not the hush of intimidation but the calm of competence. That calm is not passive. It is the active composure of citizens who know that strong rooms are built to hold strong feelings, and that free people do their best work when their fiercest convictions are shepherded by a durable process. Look closely at the mechanics. A judge's fidelity to text preserves the promise that all are equal before the sentence, not only before the sentiment. A representative's fidelity to constituents preserves the promise that the sentence remains worth reading, because the people it binds had a hand in writing it and can alter it when experience exposes a flaw. Law does not float above life. It sits in the middle of it, clarifying and constraining. Politics does not sit outside law. It runs through law, reauthoring and redirecting. Order, then, is the choreography that lets both sets of steps share a floor. Without choreography, toes get stepped on, and the dance devolves into shoving. With choreography alone, without music, the dance loses purpose. The goal is that rare marriage of rhythm and rule. Old phrases gain new texture under this light. Due process as hospitality, equal protection as a refusal to write anyone out of the script, separation of powers as a polite insistence that no single hand should hold every lever at once. Newer phrases gain sturdier spine. Accountability as the habit of returning to the record to see what was promised and what was delivered. Accessibility as the habit of drafting rules in a language that plain readers can understand. Transparency as the habit of letting the public watch the work, even when the work is messy. Order in the room, finally, is the public's rightful demand that their institutions combine rigor with empathy, guardrails with open roads, continuity with course correction. Seen this way, a veteran jurist and a first-term member of Congress do not cancel each other. They complete the picture of what a constitutional democracy attempts every day, the marriage of stability and change, of conviction and humility, of structures that last and stories that still need to be written. Move from portraits to practice. The phrase "order in the room" becomes a working ethic rather than a slogan when debates follow a pattern ordinary people recognize as fair, comprehensible, and connected to results. Begin with ground rules that dignify all sides, arguments stated Steelman, strong, evidence summarized faithfully, motives not invented, errors corrected without humiliation, victories declared without gloating. From there, the craft of judging and the craft of legislating can stage a disagreement that teaches as it resolves. One craft specializes in questions that prevent excess. What did the text authorize? Who possesses jurisdiction? Which standard of review fits? What remedy cures the wrong without creating a larger one? The other craft specializes in questions that prevent indifference. Who is still outside the reach of relief? Where do timelines and thresholds turn justice into a riddle? Which budget line makes it right real? What unintended costs are landing on neighbors with the smallest shoulders? Run these question sets together, and even complex fights begin to sort themselves into intelligible lanes. A court can insist that rules be applied consistently, that agencies respect their delegated bounds, that emergency powers do not become permanent shortcuts. A legislature can adjust the rules those courts apply, sharpen delegations, sunset emergencies, and pour resources where gaps have been mapped by experience. Order in the room is the promise that neither side is allowed to pretend the other does not exist. Each side can criticize, neither side can erase. That mutual recognition is not a mere nicety. It is the secret by which durable settlements are forged. Without it, policy alternates between overreach and whiplash. With it, policy gains the sturdiness to survive a change of winds because it has been argued to the point of clarity. Clarity, in turn, becomes the mother of consent. Citizens will tolerate outcomes they dislike if they trust the path by which those outcomes were reached, and the schedule by which those outcomes can be reviewed and revised. Trust grows when institutions model candor about trade, offs and humility about unintended consequences. Trust shrinks when institutions posture, hoard data, or launder preference through jargon. Order in the room, therefore, is not one gavel and one microphone controlling everything. It is a culture of reasons strong enough to carry disagreement without breaking into contempt. Such a culture can be taught. Teachers, judges on their benches, representatives at their dais teach it whenever they resist the sugar rush of applause in favor of the slower hunger of understanding. They teach it by owning mistakes in the record, by acknowledging the best point raised by an opponent, by distinguishing between what the law permits and what prudence recommends, by showing citizens how to chase facts across time rather than across feeds. They teach it by refusing to confuse volume with value, by remembering that speed and haste are cousins but not twins. Citizens absorb the curriculum faster than cynics expect. Give people a clear map, and they will walk it. Give them a fog of hype, and they will wander until resentment becomes a compass. Consider a few familiar terrains. A city facing a housing shortage needs judges who can police arbitrary denials and unlawful seizures, and legislators who can modernize zoning, fund infrastructure, and align incentives with actual math of construction. A state facing a surge of fentanyl overdoses needs judges who can uphold convictions consistent with due process, and legislators who can expand treatment, equip first responders, and revise protocols that waste precious minutes. A nation facing a wave of synthetic fraud needs judges who can interpret statutes covering digital conduct without inventing crimes, and legislators who can update definitions, invest in verification tools, and preserve civil liberties while closing loopholes. In each case, the tools are different, but the ethic is the same: slow enough to be careful, fast enough to be useful. Order in the room keeps the balance from slipping. Let the courtroom be strict about the record. Let the committee room be relentless about outcomes. Let both rooms be generous about the humanity of the people under discussion. Generosity does not require naivete. It requires discipline about evidence and patience with detail. The Internet rewards snap judgments. Self-government rewards the opposite. When hearings go viral, when oral arguments trend, the best public servants treat the spike of attention as an on-ramp to deeper explanation, not as an end in itself. Viral energy can fund civic appetite if it is converted into homework, follow-through, and plain language reports that turn heat into light. Crowds can smell the difference between a performance and a plan. Order in the room respects that instinct and uses it. Rhetoric shines brightest when paired with receipts. Gravitas holds longest when paired with grace. Neither is weakness. Both are the manners of adults practicing liberty in public. And because liberty at scale requires memory, the ethic includes archives, accessible dockets, searchable hearings, working links to bills and budgets, minutes that appear on time rather than disappearing into the calendar, Memory allows correction without drama and accountability without theatrics. Memory is how a community learns that promises were not confetti, but contracts. At this point, the portraits return, not as mascots, but as reminders that institutions consist of people with habits, and that habits shape hope. A jurist whose service on the Fifth Circuit began in the 1980s and included a term as chief judge illustrates what continuity looks like when guarded by discipline. A representative who reached Congress in the early 2020s after years of defending clients and learning the rhythms of a state house illustrates what responsiveness looks like when guarded by conscience. Neither story licenses cruelty, neither story licenses chaos. Stability without empathy hardens into neglect. Empathy without stability dissolves into noise. Between those cliffs runs a navigable channel, and order is the pilot that knows its bends. Follow that channel, and institutions earn the moral authority that no statute can create and no headline can destroy. That authority is a compound of small virtues: punctuality that honors the public's time, clarity that honors the public's intelligence, service that honors the public's dignity. These are ordinary virtues, which is what makes them revolutionary in a political culture that often confuses novelty with improvement. Practiced over time, they restore a fundamental confidence. Not that government will always agree with the viewer, but that it will always explain itself, absorb criticism without retaliation, and remember the difference between force and persuasion. In the end, order in the room is a vow. Arguments will be welcomed and tested. Power will be exercised and bounded. Change will be pursued and anchored. A room that can keep that vow becomes a school for citizenship, teaching patience with detail and a stubborn appetite for outcomes that touch real lives. That is the kind of order worth defending, not the quiet of fear, but the calm of competence, earned in public, maintained by habit, and renewed whenever neighbors return to the table. Order in the room matures from motto to muscle when hard cases are carried through a cadence that ordinary people can follow, replay, and trust. When arguments are not treated as performances to be scored, but as tools to be sharpened until they cut cleanly through confusion. Begin with the premise that fairness has a feel, claims introduced plainly, the strongest counter, case stated without straw, evidence sorted from emphasis, limits admitted before opponents must drag them into the light, then watch how the architecture and the scaffolding, judging and legislating, operate together when the topic is not abstract but urgent. In public safety, the judicial craft prevents panic from hardening into precedent by insisting that emergency powers expire on time and that punishments fit both text and proof. The legislative craft prevents indifference from masquerading as prudence by funding treatment, revising protocols, and writing deadlines that face the clock of real life. In housing, judges police arbitrariness and takings while lawmakers reopen bottlenecks zoning, permitting infrastructure that have turned blueprints into museum pieces. The aim is roofs, not rhetoric. In technology, courts keep agencies within the authority actually delegated, resisting the temptation to invent crimes to match headlines. Legislatures catch up definitions to realities, synthetic identities, automated harms, deep fakes, so that liberty is protected without leaving neighbors defenseless against tools that outpace yesterday's law. In education, the bench tests discipline, access, and due process against clear standards. The chamber tests funding, curriculum transparency, and student support against outcomes that families can't see. Repeat the pattern across domains and a rhythm emerges. One craft breaks excess, the other breaks neglect. One says by what authority, the other says to what end. The two are not redundant. They are the double-entry bookkeeping of power. When that rhythm is taught by example, a judge turning back applause to walk through the record line by line, A representative turning down an easy sound bite to explain the trade-off. Nobody wanted. Trust grows. Trust is not agreement. Trust is consent to be governed by reasons you can check tomorrow. Consent is not passive. Consent is the stubborn citizen's choice to keep returning to a process that has proved itself strong enough to survive both popularity and pain. Call this habit civic grace, the generosity to read an opponent's brief before tweeting a take, the humility to distinguish between what the law permits and what prudence recommends, the curiosity to ask how a proposal lands on people with smaller margins. Grace is not softness. Grace is discipline with manners. It enters the room when clerks publish calendars on time, when committees release unedited recordings, when budgets are posted in plain language, when corrections are issued before critics demand them. Memory follows grace. Public archives become reliable. Minutes do not vanish into the weekend. Receipts are kept so that narratives cannot outrun facts. Memory makes humility practical. Policies can be revised without drama because everyone saw the same ledger. None of this depends on worshiping personalities. It depends on habits. Still, habits are often learned from people who model them. And a jurist who joined the Fifth Circuit in 1985 and later served as its chief judge from 2006 to 2012 models the virtue of limits that keep institutions from improvising themselves into illegitimacy, while a representative who arrived in Congress in 2023 after defending indigent clients models the virtue of urgency that keeps institutions from congratulating themselves into paralysis. Set side by side, those biographies are not a cartoon of stop and go, but a map of how and why. Traveling together, the bench protecting the equal application of text, the chamber protecting the equal reach of results. When both purposes are alive in the same room, arguments get stronger, policies last longer, and neighbors begin to believe that the distance between outrage and outcome can be crossed without breaking the very rules that guarantee the journey is worth it. Carry that map into the conclusion, and the phrase "order in the room" expands into a citizenship curriculum that anyone can practice, whether seated at a dais or on a couch. Start with the choreography. Speak in paragraphs, not grenades. Answer the question that was asked, not the one that flatters a feed. Grant your opponent one indisputable point before advancing your own. Add the metrics, clarity measured in how quickly a newcomer can explain the dispute, accessibility measured in how easily the public can find the documents that matter, seriousness measured in whether leaders tell constituents something they did not want to hear but needed to know. Fold in the virtues that make cooperation a live option: punctuality that honors time, precision that honors intelligence, restraint that honors the distinction between force and persuasion. None of these qualities deny conviction, they shape it for work. Conviction that refuses tools becomes noise. Process that forgets purpose becomes ritual. The middle path structure with soul produces the kind of institutions that can survive being wrong because they have taught the public how to watch them change. That is the durable promise of a republic. Not perfection, but repair. Not purity, but improvement. Not unanimity, but a tested majority that can be challenged without violence and replaced without revenge. A room that keeps this promise does not fear tough witnesses or sharp questioning. It fears only the decay that follows when spectacle replaces scrutiny and performance substitutes for plan. So let the gavel stand for the vow that reasons will outlast moods. Let the microphone stand for the vow that stories from the margins will not be trimmed to fit the center. Let the camera stand for the vow that edits will not hide the most important sentence in the exchange. Let the judge's habit of reading the text aloud before interpreting it become the public's habit of reading the bill before believing the spin. Let the representative's habit of translating human Costs into line items become the public's habit of asking where the numbers meet the neighborhood. If a veteran jurist's tenure teaches sturdiness and a first-term lawmaker's record teaches responsiveness, the fusion teaches stewardship, power held with open hands, answers given with open files, change pursued with open eyes. From that stewardship comes a more ambitious meaning of order, not the kind that commands silence, but the kind that commands respect because it has earned it. On time, on the record, under the lights, in the hearing of the very people whose lives give law its moral point. Order in the room, finally, is the people's work made visible and honest, the architecture of law carrying the scaffolding of reform, the scaffolding of reform renewing the architecture of law, both standing because the foundation is shared. When that foundation is tended, a shared text read in good faith, a shared process kept in good repair, a shared memory curated without spin, the republic does not merely endure, it persuades. It persuades skeptics who wanted to believe but needed proof. It persuades allies who feared that adulthood in politics had no poetry left. And it persuades the next generation that the strongest rooms are not the quietest, but the fairest rooms where truth is expected to speak up, where power is expected to answer, and where the rest of us are expected to keep showing up until the promises on paper sound like the neighborhoods we love.